Hello there, I'm David Benitez, and this is Extreme Vocal Institute, and today we're going to be talking about unlocking your high screams. In this video, we'll be talking about some of the misconceptions about the high scream itself, different aspects of the melodic voice that have to be incorporated in there, ways to open it up and further manipulate the sound after laying out the foundation, and then really more clearly identifying all of the different moving parts happening underneath the surface behind the sound itself. Because this is a more complex movement than people may think. Now, like I just mentioned, it's very important to understand how your actual melodic voice comes into play when it comes to your screaming range in general, both high and low. As much as we can manipulate sound with different areas of the vocal tract and the muscles of the mouth and everything else involved, we can only do that to a certain degree. And no matter what we do, the sound is going to be rooted in what we are doing melodically, because as I always say and mention to you guys, all screams are pitch-based. To that degree, it's very important to make sure you're warmed up melodically at least a bit before diving into things like this. So if you're going to be experimenting with what we're going to cover in this video, I highly recommend you go through a melodic warm-up first. If you're unsure of where to start, you can check out other videos on our channel here about that topic. Now, if you don't have the biggest range melodically in the world, that's totally fine. It's not about just having the widest range of anybody who's ever lived. It's more so about being able to provide contrast from where you've already been. Say you're doing more of a mid scream or a low scream, you just want to move that starting point up a bit. And in response, the scream will appear to be much higher than where you came from. And because of that, you will get the right idea across. And this is why you don't have to be able to hit the highest pitches in the world in order to have your high scream be, quote, good enough, if that makes sense. Now, with melody and pitch, as I talk about in our videos here on pitched screaming and other topics as well, you can hear little bits of the vocal cord movement behind any sort of scream. For example, in the middle of a road low scream for me, if I strip away the layers, there is vocal cord movement behind it. If I move forward the other way, you can still hear that the tonality is there. So there is vocal cord movement involved because that's what's actually creating the size and the depth of the sound, while other areas are responsible for the actual distortion within that scream. So it's about that balancing act. Now, if we can change the starting point of what the scream is, we can further manipulate the sound and send it upward in a more natural way before we get into all of the shaping work and tone work that we'll be doing after the fact. Now, the reason this is difficult for some, especially a lot of you guys who are self-taught, is many people approach the high screams the same way that they do their lows, and everything kind of is having the same jumping off point, and then it's just about trying to bend things and scoop in one direction or kind of lift it and shoot things upwards in the other direction, but always coming from that same starting point. And what I'm suggesting to all of you guys at home is actually adjusting where you start the sound in the first place. What this will do is give you that different jumping off point and an entirely different type of tonality that's going to resonate differently in the air as well, and give the entire core of your scream tone a much higher point of resonance. And what this will do is actually bring it up into that area where you kind of sonically want things to live. A lot of the feedback we get here, and a question that we get a lot that people get troubled with, is that people feel as though their screams aren't high enough. Like there's something getting in the way, or there's some sort of block, and they're unable to get the sound either high enough or projected out far enough in order to have it be good enough as well. And what we're going to talk about here is how to get yourself to that point and kind of break down some of those misconceptions about the sound. You don't really want to come at everything from the same point because every sound you're going to make is different. Even the way I'm talking to you now, you can hear that the sentences that I'm speaking have this kind of rising and falling action. And that's because that's just what human speech is like. Some people do it a little more than others. That's kind of a person-to-person characteristic. We can control our screaming tone in the same way that we can have these upwards inflections happen within our tone without necessarily having to muscle and squeeze our way up into that. It doesn't need to be forced. In actuality, with how higher sounds work in comparison to lows, in the vocal cords themselves, when we move up and up and up, what's happening is the vocal cords are actually being stretched and then actually brought closer together, and this makes the vibrations happen at a faster rate. And this is all that high pitch is. That's the only thing that's happening. And it's all going on here within the larynx itself. Whereas in the opposite direction, as we move down, it's actually the vocal cords being collapsed in slightly in the actual larynx itself, so they're loosened and spread a little farther apart to allow the vibrations to be slower and bigger. Which creates lower pitches. In the moment, we're not really thinking, especially when we're just singing or even more so when we're speaking, we're not really thinking about how to get that to happen. We just kind of think it and it happens by itself. Just like I'm not thinking about all the different neurons and little bits of connective tissue that go between the brain all the way down to my hand. I just can think, wiggle my finger, and it happens. We can develop kind of the same relationship with our screams in that we don't have to feel like moving up is strenuous. We kind of want to get rid of the idea of it being higher to begin with, because oftentimes this leads to people stretching and reaching for the sound. Like very often if someone has a low around here, and you slow down the approach to the high, you hear this kind of clamp that happens, and you can hear the pitch kind of squeaking upwards. And that's what I mean by that reaching. We're not starting from a higher point to begin with, and while making the sound, people try and force it up there versus being there to begin with. If we change that starting point from to around here, to maybe here, to maybe around here, hear how it's higher on its own now, and it kind of shot straight out versus having that lead in where we had to scoop into it, versus if I bring it even higher, it brings the tonality up even higher, and now we have a higher scream without nearly the same level of strain. And I'm balancing it and feeling this out in the same way that I do my higher notes by not forcing any of the motions to happen. Now, one thing you'll notice is in the examples I'm giving you guys, I'll do a false chord one and a fry. You can hear a fair amount of throat noise in here. You'll notice I'm doing these very unshaped because we're still talking about just the bare bones of the sound. The important factor is all of that lower throat noise and all that weirdness in the sound is supposed to be there. For you guys practicing at home right now, this throws a lot of people off because these lower vibrations within the higher sound kind of make it so it seems like the scream isn't high enough. And then people try and force things even higher, which can lead to a lot of different health problems when it comes down to your voice. These lower sounds are supposed to be there because this is what's actually giving the sound body and depth. And in context with music, because all of these different sounds we're making here with screaming and otherwise are all designed to be done with music and not necessarily without. This isn't meant to really be done acoustically, and it makes more sense with music. when paired with a band, all of the same frequency areas eaten up by the guitars and different parts of the drums and cymbals and other things actually exist in the same amount of space as all that throat noise in the scream. So when you do it in context, the band kind of takes up the room that the lower end is in, and what you're left with is the piercing high end that just slices through all the other sounds and makes it so you can really hear it very crystal clear, and it has that kind of sparkling quality to it. And then the low end and the throatiness and the noise becomes not what you hear, but what you feel behind the sound. And this is what actually gives that type of scream impact and character and makes it so you can feel it and the intensity behind it, rather than the sound kind of being thin, where people kind of try and take all of that low end out, either by squeezing it out or by editing it out in their music after the fact, and you're left with a sound that's kind of shrill and thin, where it has a lot of that sparkling high end, but ends up feeling a little lackluster, because now you're lacking the body and the depth and the actual feeling behind what was being done in the first place. This is why oftentimes people have an easier time popping out high screams at band practice or maybe at a show, and then as soon as you're trying to practice at home or trying to record a song in the studio, it's like, why do my screams not work anymore? Why does everything sound different? Why does it seem like I seemingly forgot how to do these things even though I do them all the time? And it's because of the context that's being provided around it. So make sure you familiarize yourself with how these high screams behave in the space around you. That means practicing these more at home. To really familiarize yourself with all of the different characteristics of the sound itself, so that you can start to learn to use the fullness and the depth of the sound kind of as the steering wheel, rather than something that's distracting you in the moment and making you think that what you're doing is wrong. Now, like I said, this is just the very open, pure version of the sound before manipulating it. If you can get the sound nice and high, ah, na, ma, 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 na. If you can get it nice and high before shaping, that means you'll actually be able to manipulate even further without it requiring strain. Like I talk about a lot here, we use muscle manipulation all the time when it comes to our sound, and I'm doing it right now in communicating what I'm saying to you, because it's just a series of mouth and muscle and teeth and tongue and jaw movements that are bending the sound waves into a pattern that we both recognize as words and language and associate meaning with that. And remember, all we're doing with screaming is a heightened form of communication. So kind of use those same reflexes that you have when you're speaking and incorporate that into your screaming voice. Sound manipulation doesn't have to be tightening the body and the throat and the face as hard as you can to try and send the sound out in an intense way. Just because it's an intense sound doesn't mean it has to feel as intense. You should be able to really allow these sounds to flow out and change little things about just the very end of that travel path to be able to really alter that sound and have it come out in the way that you want it to, rather than having to like take a really big gasp and be like, I hope this sounds good enough, as if it's not up to you what it sounds like. Remember that you're the one in control here. And that if you're struggling with your tone, in relation to this video with your high screams specifically, and you feel like you can't get them to sit right, remember that they're not the ones controlling you, it's you controlling it. And we can get there as long as we kind of follow along these steps and really take our time with it as well. So keep that in mind. With shape manipulation, now I'm going to take these higher sounds and send them out in different ways. I'll give you both a false chord example and a fry example. Here's false chord, then I'm going to move up. So rather than in the middle, ma, I'm going to move it upwards. Ma, na, ma, na. So that'll be high enough for now, for this example with the false chord. Now I'm going to manipulate the shape of my mouth and create more space. Ah, that's going to make the sound a bit brighter, especially because I'm raising the cheekbones a little bit, and it's going to make it so I'm sending the sound out in a different way. Nah versus nah. Hear that difference? It added that little bit of sparkle up here, and in context with music, that's what's really going to fly through. Additionally, I can kind of raise the back of the tongue a little bit, so I'm going from ah, this shape, to this shape. That's purely a tongue thing. I've done nothing in the throat. I'm keeping everything very relaxed. I'm just raising the cheekbones and raising the tongue slightly. If I talk like that, or sing like that, you can hear the brightness that's added. And that's going to be intensified even further because of the amount of space and energy the scream tone takes up. Again, high false chord, nah! Shape difference, nah! Tongue difference, nah! Hear that? It really sends the sound out, nah! In a much different way. Because now, because of that tiny slit in the back of the mouth that we're creating with the tongue, like that, it makes it so now all of the air is having to travel through all this open space, squeeze itself through a smaller space, and then flower back out again. So we're creating a pretty large amount of distortion with really barely any muscle movement, and in a way where we don't have to work that hard to maintain it, because it's just tongue placement and smiling a little bit. And sometimes, depending on what you're going for, that's really all you need. If you're going for kind of the more open sound, that's kind of how you get there. However, in a lot of newer metal music, scream tones tend to be more distorted. People are going towards the more and more chaotic kind of sound, which then requires further manipulation from the tongue. If you can create that kind of pushed forward shape with the tongue, in addition to raising it, now everything's kind of really packed in, but in a way that's all mouth-based and not throat-based. That turns the sound into this, and it brings it up even higher. And if I intensify that muscle movement even more, that creates an even higher sound. And again, it doesn't make the throatiness go away, because that's not the point. Remember that it's supposed to be there. In the example of Fry, which is naturally going to have more higher resonance points in it just because of the nature of the sound, versus the false chords, which are just physically larger than the vocal cords, so it's going to have that deeper sound. The false chord high is going to appear to be higher. You can look up more differences and learn more about how false chord and Fry screams relate to each other in that video here on our channel as well. So now, when you hear the Fry example, ma, you can hear even already in the middle scream that there's a lot more going on up here. If I raise that tonally, ma, 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 you can hear that there's more sparkle. Now I'm going to add the shape. Now I'm going to add the tongue. Now I'm going to add the bend of the tongue. And you can hear how the sound flies out differently and how a lot of energy is added to it because of all these different twists and turns that the sound has to go through at the very end. Now, another important note is head resonance. High screams in particular are very dependent on your ability to allow the sound to kind of exist within the skull and keep loose and relaxed enough to allow the sound to kind of bounce around a fair amount before exiting the body, because this is going to give it even more intensity, even more energy, and create even more sound for yourself without having to force it or squeeze it out. This is how to allow it to happen naturally. For example, if I kind of squeak a high note out, if I kind of squeak them out that way, that changes how the sound is coming out and what I'm actually allowing to happen. Versus if I just let the sound out, hear how much more space that takes up? Versus, if I squeak it out, that's the throat tightening around the vocal cords, trying to force this to happen when it doesn't really need to. If you just kind of get out of your own way and just let the sound come out in the way that it already knows how, you can let the sound be more natural. Even if it's a bit shaky and loose at first and a little unstable, that's totally fine. That generally means that you haven't spent as much physical time in your upper register as you have the lower. So the key is to actually exist in the upper register more often in your practice and let it be unstable. Kind of let it sound like crap for a little while, because that's the only way your body's kind of going to understand what to actually do when you get into these upper levels of the voice. Because for now, it's just shaky because the body's not sure what to do. And if you can spend more time up there, you'll give your body the kind of time to develop and adjust and adapt to what it is you're doing. And the same will happen with your high screams, both false chord and fry or otherwise. Now, if you're having trouble moving the pitch up or having difficulty kind of thinking about how to move the tonality up, and if you notice it kind of defaulting down a lot, here's a couple of mental tricks to kind of send the screaming tone up. For false chord, I tend to create visuals around like a barking dog sound, ruff, ruff, no, to kind of trigger the sound at first. If that's something that's useful for you, just think of a tinier dog. Smaller dog than the first one. So instead of really big, angry, ruff, ruff, think smaller, ruff, ruff. Suddenly you get a different type of vibration. Ruff, ruff. If I sustain, ruff. Now I have something closer to what I want. Even tinier dog, ruff, 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 ruff. Hear what's happening? We can kind of trick the body and the brain into allowing these sounds to happen if we can create little imagery things and little exercises like this to coax the sound out and allow it to exit the body this way rather than trying to force it. What we're talking about here starts to get into the territory of what I call line theory, which gets a little spacey, but essentially the overview is eliminating the idea of high and low, or loud or soft, and all these different directions you feel like you have to go in and force yourself to go in, and instead think of all sound being the same and coming from the same point, kind of in the middle of the face, and rather than having to aim up or down for what it is you're doing, imagine everything is coming out in this straight line. And then a lot of the sounds you're making will become easier. This is sometimes how I help people to actually coax their high screams out in the first place, if that's something that's been troubling. By focusing on the tonality and sending it out in a direction and being able to build that into the scream without feeling like I have to shoot up this way or clamp down this way in order to get the end result I'm going for. So kind of ride the line if that's something that's helpful. Ma, 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 ma. And you'll start to notice you're able to get sound out much clearer and with way less strain. Especially with high screams, we want to make sure we are constantly adjusting to make sure we aren't working too hard for any given sound. This is true across the board, but especially for high screams, because we as human beings tend to overwork our systems as we move upper in our voices, because the human body doesn't want to sound weak or frail. And a lot of people don't spend enough time in their upper registers, so people try and cram the higher areas down into how the lower notes feel. And this creates a lot of muscle tension. And many people think you actually need to use more air for higher screams and notes, when in actuality, you need to use less. As I'm moving higher and higher, I'm actually backing off of the air pressure more and more. Not letting it go, just taking my foot off the gas a little bit. Think the difference between driving on the highway versus back roads, if that analogy makes sense. You don't need to use that much force from the diaphragm in order to sustain these sounds, because all we're doing is bringing the vocal cords closer together. They're vibrating faster, which means the air already has less space to escape the body. And from there, all of the manipulation we're doing is actually taking away more and more space and making the actual sound and air itself have to travel around more things before exiting the body. Which means if we push too hard with the diaphragm, we will undo the work that all these different little bits of muscle tissue are doing and force everything apart. Like when you're trying to lift something that's way too heavy for you and your hands just let go without asking you, that's what will start happening in the throat. And oftentimes this is what leads to the kind of war that can sometimes develop between the diaphragm and your air pressure and the actual throat and what's going on here with your placement and your additional shaping on top of that. And it makes things fight against each other rather than work together cohesively. In order to make sure your high screams aren't tension-based, you really want to make sure that you can keep that body calm. No! No! And send the sounds out in a way that's not requiring everything to lock up and force its way out. This is true across the board, like I keep mentioning, but especially with high screams. Now, as a recap, when you're starting to unlock your high screams and getting into this type of work, remember to work on your melodic voice as well, if not more often than this at first. It's going to be much safer for you to work on areas of your singing voice and making it so you can adjust and unlock little bits of your upper register. That's going to be safer than just trying to force your screams higher because there's just less going on. So use the delicate parts of your voice first and use what's going to be safer and a little bit more natural, and then apply that to what you already know about your screaming voice. It may take longer, but this is going to be much better for you, and you're going to have much stronger, fuller, and longer lasting results if you approach it this way. Remember not to approach your highs the same way you approach everything else. It's a different sound happening in a different register of your voice, and therefore requires a different balance and different contrasting motions between what you do in other screams and other parts of your voice. Get the sounds nice and open first before adding different shape manipulations on top of what it is you're doing. Remember that you don't have to have the highest sounding scream in the world in order for it to be deemed correct, because it's all about creating contrast within what you yourself are doing. And then additionally, allowing these lower, throatier, messier kinds of sounds to exist within your sound itself, because that's actually going to be the full depth and impact and power of your sound. Keep calm, set your trajectory, and send your sound straight out of the body, and you'll be able to unlock all of the different high sounds that you're going for. We cover high screams in many courses and much more in our brand new EVI NOW program, which is our entirely online guided lesson program. And you can go and check that out today if you want to learn more about how to start forming your high screams and then further develop them once you've looked at everything that we've talked about here in this video. If this video here was helpful, make sure to go ahead and give it a like and subscribe to our channel here, because we're going to be expanding on this topic and many others as we continue to roll forward. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, scream responsibly.